Arabella Linford arrived in London on a morning that smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp stone, the kind of morning that suggested nothing kind was waiting to happen, only endurance. The carriage door opened onto a street already awake with purpose, footmen moving briskly, ladies stepping down with practiced elegance, and Arabella understood at once that the season did not pause to assess who had come prepared and who had come bare-handed. She stepped down carefully, smoothing the fall of her long hair over her shoulder, aware that it was her most conspicuous luxury, thick and uncut, a relic of a life before careful economies, before learning how quickly abundance could vanish. Her invitation lay folded in her glove, thin as a promise, and her guardian's silence beside her was not the comfortable kind, but the kind that implied obligation rather than welcome. No one announced her arrival with interest. No one hurried. She was neither late nor early, merely present, and presence, she would learn, was not the same as belonging. Inside the house, refinement unfolded with surgical precision. Voices stayed low. Laughter landed exactly where it was meant to land. Silverware settled, silk whispered, and the message was delivered without a single unkind word. A chair beside her remained conspicuously empty, untouched, as if acknowledging her place would contaminate the arrangement. Arabella stood with gloved hands folded, spine straight, expression composed, and accepted the omission without flinching. She had learned, long before London, that visible hurt only invited further cruelty. What mattered was control. What mattered was not giving the room what it wanted. So she held herself still, breathing evenly, long hair pinned simply at her nape, and let the slight pass through her rather than into her. Around her, conversation continued, seamless and polite, and no one looked directly at her long enough to be accused of noticing. It was then, precisely then, that Duke Sebastian Viamont looked up. He had been listening with half his attention to a discussion that bored him, his mind already cataloguing alliances and absences, when the imbalance in the room caught his eye. Power, he knew, was most visible where it pretended not to exist. He saw the empty chair. He saw the woman who had been denied it. More importantly, he saw how she carried the denial. Arabella did not shrink. She did not fidget. She did not attempt to soften herself into acceptability. She simply remained, composed and unyielding, as though she had decided long ago that dignity was not something to be granted. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that instant, recognition sparked, not of romance, not yet, but of something rarer. He saw restraint that mirrored his own. She saw attention without entitlement. Arabella looked away first, not in submission but in choice, and the room exhaled, unaware that anything had shifted. Yet something had. The season had rules, unspoken and exacting, designed to preserve advantage and erase inconvenience. Arabella had entered it with nothing that the ton valued, no fortune, no champion, no margin for error. And Sebastian Viamont, watching her stand where she was not meant to stand, understood with unsettling clarity that the rules had just presented him with a question, one he had never intended to answer. Arabella learned quickly that mornings in London were not meant for rest. They were meant for evaluation. Doors opened early to admit women, armed with smiles sharpened by experience, each visit a quiet audit of worth. At the first morning call she attended, Arabella stood near the edge of a drawing room heavy with florals and expectation, her long hair coiled neatly, her gown clean but unmistakably modest. Eyes skimmed her the way one skimmed ledgers, efficiently, looking for deficits. Compliments were offered with pauses built in, invitations phrased as hypotheticals, questions asked that were never truly questions at all. Where was her family settled now? How unfortunate about her father. How brave of her to come to town regardless. Gratitude, she understood, was expected before she had been offered anything. She answered politely, sparingly, refusing to perform humility for an audience that thrived on it. Each sentence was weighed, each silence intentional. When a matron suggested, kindly of course, that Arabella might benefit from attaching herself to a more established household, Arabella inclined her head without agreeing. Survival did not require surrender. It required attention. She noticed how conversations shifted when certain names were spoken, how House of Greymore hovered at the edges of influence without ever appearing directly. She noticed which smiles cooled when she entered a room, and which lingered out of curiosity rather than approval. London, she realized, was not cruel by accident. It was precise. Across the room, Duke Sebastian Viamont observed with equal precision. He recognized the pattern forming around Arabella, the subtle tightening meant to force compliance. He had seen it countless times, usually enacted on women who learned too late that gratitude was a leash. When a pointed remark threatened to corner her into visible discomfort, he intervened without spectacle, redirecting the room's attention with a single well-placed comment that shifted the current elsewhere. It was nothing anyone could accuse him of, nothing that demanded repayment, and that was deliberate. Power, when used correctly, left no fingerprints. Arabella felt the pressure ease before she understood why. Only later, as she replayed the morning in her mind, did she recognize the alteration, an opening that should not have been there. The knowledge unsettled her. Kindness backed by authority was rarely free. Yet Sebastian did not approach her. He did not claim the adjustment he had made. He simply watched, ensuring the balance held. That restraint mattered more than the act itself. When their paths crossed briefly as guests departed, Sebastian inclined his head in acknowledgement, nothing more. Arabella returned the gesture, meeting his gaze without flinching. There was no smile, no gratitude offered aloud. What passed between them was an understanding sharper than courtesy. The rules had bent, only slightly, and Arabella knew two things with certainty. First, the season would not forgive her for noticing. Second, the Duke who had intervened without claiming her attention was far more dangerous than one who would have demanded it. By the third day, the whispers had acquired shape. Arabella did not hear them directly at first. She felt them, a subtle withdrawal of warmth when she entered a room, a pause before her name that carried unnecessary weight. She learned quickly that scandal did not announce itself loudly. It arrived dressed as concern, as regret, as the careful lowering of a voice meant to signal sympathy while ensuring the message traveled. Her father's name surfaced more often than hers, always paired with vague disapproval and unfinished sentences that implied far more than they said. No one accused him outright. That was not the style. They simply allowed his memory to sour in polite company, as though decay were inevitable. Arabella listened without interruption when a distant relation finally spoke plainly enough to be understood. Her father, she was told, had mismanaged funds. He had offended the wrong people. He had failed to understand how things were done. Each phrase slid neatly into the next, forming a narrative that required no proof because it relied on familiarity rather than fact. House of Greymore lingered behind it all, never named directly, but present in the way certain doors closed before Arabella could knock. Invitations slowed. A promised introduction failed to materialize. The season, efficient as ever, began to narrow her path. Fear arrived swiftly, then steadied. Arabella did not indulge it. She had lived too long with uncertainty to allow panic to dictate her movements. Instead, she observed. She noted who repeated the story with enthusiasm and who did so reluctantly. She counted how often Greymore's interest surfaced in unrelated conversations, how frequently advantage aligned with her father's supposed disgrace. Patterns emerged where coincidence should have been. Grief pressed in, sharpened now by suspicion, but beneath it stirred something colder and more useful. Resolve. It was Duke Sebastian Viamont who requested a private word, the message delivered with careful neutrality, offering no hint of motive. They spoke in a quiet corner of a gallery where conversation blurred into background noise. He did not offer comfort. He did not apologize for the behavior of the ton. Instead, he asked her what she intended to do. The question was not idle. It carried weight, an expectation of answer rather than acquiescence. Arabella met his gaze steadily, her long hair pinned simply, her posture unyielding. She told him she intended to endure. Not survive, not retreat, but endure, because endurance implied continuity and choice. Sebastian studied her for a moment longer than politeness required. He recognized the calculation behind her composure, the refusal to be hurried into collapse. It unsettled him in a way he did not immediately name. When they parted, nothing had been promised. No alliance had been declared. Yet Arabella walked away with a clearer understanding of her position. The season was closing around her with deliberate pressure, and House of Greymore stood at its center, unseen but decisive. She also understood something else, newly dangerous in its clarity. The Duke who had spoken to her without offering rescue had just acknowledged her as a participant rather than a problem, and that recognition, once given, could not be withdrawn. The ultimatum arrived disguised as practicality, which made it harder to refuse and impossible to misunderstand. Arabella's guardian chose a quiet afternoon to deliver it, his voice measured, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for concern if she had not known him so well. He spoke of expenses, of obligations, of the wisdom of limiting one's exposure when circumstances were uncertain. Then he named the consequence plainly. If Arabella did not secure a suitable attachment within the next weeks, she would be sent back to the country, removed from London before her presence became an embarrassment difficult to manage. It was not framed as punishment, it was framed as necessity, and that made it far more dangerous. Arabella listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her long hair unbound for once, falling in a dark, unguarded sweep over her shoulders. She felt desperation rise sharply, an instinctive response to being cornered, but she did not allow it to reach her face. Desperation was precisely what the season demanded of women like her. It softened them. It made them grateful for crumbs. She would not give it that satisfaction. Instead, she asked one question, calm and exact. What, precisely, constituted suitable? Her guardian hesitated, and in that hesitation, she found her answer. Suitable meant controllable. Suitable meant safe for everyone except her. When he left, Arabella remained seated long after the door closed, breathing evenly until the pressure in her chest eased. She understood the shape of the trap now. If she rushed into a match, she would confirm every assumption made about her worth. If she refused, she would be erased. The choice was engineered to look inevitable. That realization steadied her. She had lived long enough under quiet constraint to recognize it when it revealed itself so clearly. The season was not offering her opportunity. It was testing her willingness to disappear. Her thoughts turned, unbidden, to Duke Sebastian Viamont. Not as a solution, not yet, but as a variable the season had not accounted for. He had intervened without claiming her. He had asked her intention rather than prescribing it. Those were not the actions of a man interested in easy control. The realization unsettled her as much as it strengthened her. Relying on him would be dangerous. Refusing to consider him at all might be foolish. They encountered each other again that evening, briefly, in a corridor lit low and warm. The exchange was polite, restrained, yet charged with unspoken awareness. Sebastian's gaze lingered a fraction longer than courtesy allowed, as though measuring something newly altered. Arabella understood then that he saw the pressure closing around her. More importantly, he was waiting to see how she would respond to it. She straightened, meeting his attention without appeal. Whatever choice she made, it would be deliberate. She would not vanish quietly. If the season insisted on forcing her hand, she would choose where to place it. And for the first time since her arrival, Arabella felt something close to certainty. The rules were tightening, but they had not yet closed. The gathering was designed to impress, which meant it was designed to exclude. Arabella recognized this as soon as she entered the room, where space itself was arranged to reinforce rank, clusters forming and reforming around names that carried weight. She moved carefully, aware that visibility was now a double-edged thing. Her long hair was arranged with deliberate simplicity, her gown chosen for restraint rather than display. She did not wish to invite attention, yet she understood that avoiding it entirely was no longer possible. The season had noticed her once. It would not forget her easily. She was standing near a marble column, listening without speaking, when the shift occurred. It began subtly, a ripple of attention moving outward, conversation pausing and redirecting. Arabella felt it before she saw its cause. Duke Sebastian Viamont crossed the room with unhurried precision, his presence recalibrating the space around him. He did not look at her immediately. He did not announce himself. He simply altered the room by moving through it, as though hierarchy itself adjusted to accommodate him. When he stopped beside her, the silence sharpened. "Will you join me?" he said quietly, extending his hand toward a place she had not been invited to occupy, near the center of the room where the title stood with effortless entitlement. The words were polite. The implication was not. Every eye fixed on them, waiting to see whether she would hesitate, whether she would betray uncertainty or gratitude or fear. Arabella did none of those things. She placed her hand in his without pause, her grip steady, her expression composed. As they moved together, she felt the room tighten, resentment and fascination braiding into something electric. She understood at once what Sebastian had done. He had not defended her. He had not excused her presence. He had redefined it. By placing her where power gathered, he forced the ton to confront a reality they preferred to deny. That inclusion, once demonstrated, could not be unseen. Shock gave way to whispers. Some faces hardened, others recalculated. Arabella felt exhilaration flare, sharp and bright, followed swiftly by fear. Attention was dangerous. Yet retreat now would undo everything. She held her place, breathing evenly, aware that this moment would be remembered long after the evening ended. Sebastian released her hand only once they were positioned, his demeanor unchanged, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet she sensed the risk he had taken. He had broken no rule explicitly, but he had exposed how easily the rules could be bent by will alone. The season would not forgive him lightly, and it would punish her first. Their eyes met briefly. No reassurance passed between them. None was needed. An alliance had been formed under pressure, not spoken but unmistakable. Arabella understood then that she was no longer merely enduring the season. She was shaping it, however narrowly, by refusing to step aside. As conversation resumed, altered and cautious, Arabella felt something settle within her. She had entered the season with nothing it valued. Now, because one man had chosen to change the rules rather than obey them, she stood where she was not meant to stand, and the room would never arrange itself the same way again. The consequences arrived before the next morning call. Arabella sensed them in the smallest recalibrations, the invitations that came folded more stiffly, the smiles that thinned, the way conversation stalled for half a breath when she entered a room and then resumed with careful cheer. Visibility, she learned, carried a price, and the season collected promptly. The women who had once ignored her now assessed her with open curiosity or quiet irritation, measuring how much of her new position belonged to her and how much belonged to the Duke who had placed her there. Men inclined their heads with new interest, but the interest was edged, speculative, as though she were a question the room had not agreed how to answer. Arabella met it with composure. She altered nothing about herself that could be accused of presumption. Her long hair remained simply arranged, her gowns restrained, her manners exact. If she had been granted space, she would occupy it without apology and without embellishment. Still, the pressure mounted. A compliment carried a sting. A question arrived with a trap hidden beneath it. She learned which drawing rooms welcomed her as novelty and which tolerated her as inconvenience. Through it all, House of Greymore remained a presence she felt rather than saw, a tightening at the edges of opportunity, a shadow that lengthened whenever she stepped forward. Sebastian observed the backlash with controlled displeasure. He had expected resistance. He had not expected how swiftly it would target her rather than him. The precision of it offended him. When a remark delivered with a laugh threatened to corner Arabella into visible discomfort at a public gathering, he intervened again, this time more decisively. He dismantled the insult with a single sentence so exact it left no opening for reply. The room laughed where it was told to laugh. The matter ended. Power, when wielded cleanly, left no mess. Arabella felt the relief before she identified its source. She did not turn to him immediately. She refused the posture of the rescued. Only later did she meet his gaze, offering a brief nod that acknowledged the act without surrendering credit for her own steadiness. Sebastian accepted it as it was given. No thanks were owed. None were expected. The exchange sharpened something between them. She understood now that his protection came with risk, not only to his reputation but to his patience. He was choosing this, again and again, with deliberate restraint. That knowledge unsettled her. It also fortified her. If the season intended to make her an example, she would ensure the example was not one of collapse. By the time she returned home that evening, Arabella had reached a clear conclusion. Being seen was costly, but invisibility was fatal. She would pay the price of attention rather than accept erasure. The season might tighten its grip. House of Greymore might move more openly. Let them. She was no longer alone in the open, and she had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. The rules were not immutable. They were enforced by people, and people could be made to hesitate. The invitation arrived with enthusiasm too carefully expressed to be genuine. Arabella recognized the tone at once, the way insistence was dressed as encouragement, the way her participation was framed as an honor she would be ungrateful to refuse. A musical evening, intimate yet well attended, and would she not share her talents? The request was repeated often enough to remove doubt. They expected her to falter. They wanted the spectacle of effort without polish, courage without pedigree. Declining would confirm every quiet judgment made about her fragility. Accepting would invite scrutiny sharpened to a blade. Arabella accepted. On the evening itself, the room glowed with lamplight and anticipation. She stood near the instrument, long hair pinned back more carefully than usual, her hands steady despite the attention pressing in from all sides. She was not a trained performer. Her instruction had been sporadic. her practice shaped more by solitude than society. Still, she had learned long ago that perfection was not the same as authority. Authority came from deciding not to retreat. As she seated herself, conversation softened into expectant quiet, the kind that waited for misstep. She began. The music was not flawless. A discerning ear could find its seams, yet what filled the room was not error but intention. Arabella played with control, each phrase deliberate, refusing to rush where nerves urged haste. The restraint in her performance mirrored the restraint with which she had entered the season, and the effect unsettled the room. Laughter did not come where it had been prepared. Instead, attention held, surprised into stillness. When the final note faded, the pause that followed was real. Applause rose slowly, then with sincerity, not generous enough to be kind, but honest enough to matter. Sebastian had watched without interruption, his focus unwavering. He saw the moment for what it was, not a display of talent, but a claim of space. Arabella had chosen exposure over erasure and had refused to apologize for the choice. Admiration threaded through him, sharp and undeniable, carrying an edge of something more dangerous. When their paths crossed later in a narrow corridor, the air tightened with proximity. They stood close enough that movement required decision. For a breath, neither spoke. Sebastian's hand lifted as though to steady her, then stopped, suspended between impulse and restraint. Arabella felt the awareness of him like heat, immediate and clarifying. She did not step back. She did not step forward. The space between them became deliberate, charged with everything not yet allowed. Footsteps sounded nearby, and the moment passed without resolution. As they separated, Arabella understood what the evening had cost her, and what it had given her. She had not been spared scrutiny. She had survived it on her own terms. The season adjusted again, reluctantly, as it always did when confronted with composure it could not dismiss. And Sebastian, walking away with his control intact but strained, knew with unwelcome certainty that the danger between them no longer lay in what the tongue might do. It lay in what restraint itself was beginning to demand. Sebastian did not act immediately, which was how Arabella knew whatever he was planning would matter. He allowed the echoes of the musical evening to settle, allowed the tongue to decide, incorrectly, that the moment had passed and the balance had restored itself. Only then did he move. The approach was careful, calculated, and directed not at Arabella but at one of the season's quiet architects, a patroness whose approval functioned as an unspoken credential. He framed the matter as discernment rather than charity, speaking of observation, of composure under pressure, of the value of recognizing substance where others chased familiarity. He never mentioned Arabella's lack. He spoke only of her presence. The effect was immediate but discreet. Doors that had hovered uncertainly now opened with purpose. Introductions were made without hesitation. Arabella found herself addressed not as a curiosity but as a woman whose attendance carried expectation rather than indulgence. The shift was subtle enough to be deniable, which made it effective. She recognized Sebastian's hand in it at once and felt the mixed reaction sharpen inside her. Opportunity was a relief. Dependence was not. She accepted the opening without effusiveness, determined not to let gratitude replace agency. Their partnership, if it could be called that, became deliberate. They were seen together often enough to establish pattern, never so frequently as to invite accusation. Sebastian did not hover. He did not guide her conversation or claim her time. Instead, he positioned her where choice existed and let her decide how to use it. Arabella learned quickly, listening more than she spoke, shaping impressions rather than chasing them. She felt the season recalibrate, not welcoming her, but acknowledging her presence as a fact rather than a problem. With access came information. Arabella began to hear her father's name used more cautiously, the certainty of disgrace softened by doubt. She also began to notice how often House of Greymore surfaced in unrelated contexts, its interests woven through patronage and exclusion alike. The realization tightened something in her chest. This was not coincidence. This was design. When she shared her observations with Sebastian, he did not dismiss them. He asked questions instead, precise and unsettling, encouraging her to articulate what she suspected rather than what she feared. The tension between them deepened alongside the work. Their conversations grew quieter, more charged, each exchange an exercise in restraint. They stood close without touching, spoke candidly without confessing, aware that every unspoken thing accumulated weight. Arabella understood now that Sebastian's involvement was not an act of benevolence. It was a choice, one that carried consequence for him as well as her. As the season advanced, Arabella felt herself changing. She was no longer merely reacting to pressure. She was learning how it moved, how it could be redirected. The rules had not vanished. They had shifted just enough to reveal their seams. And standing at the edge of that revelation, Arabella realized that whatever came next would require more than endurance. It would require intention. Arabella had not intended to search for answers that afternoon. The discovery came quietly, disguised as tidying, as the small domestic order one imposes when the mind needs something steady to do. Her father's papers were kept in a narrow escritoire that smelled faintly of old ink and cedar, the contents thinned by necessity over the years. Most of what remained was ordinary: receipts, correspondence of little consequence, the detritus of a life lived carefully near its end. It was a ledger, tucked where it did not belong, that caught her attention. The dates were irregular. The sums did not align with her memory of her father's accounts. She read it once, then again, slower, a chill settling with each line. The irregularities were not clumsy. They were deliberate. Transactions routed through names she did not recognize, balances adjusted just enough to suggest error rather than theft. And there, recurring with quiet persistence, was a reference to an entity she knew too well to dismiss: Graymore, controlled interests, abbreviated, veiled, but unmistakable once seen. Arabella's breath stilled. Her father had been careful to the point of severity. He had taught her that precision was a kind of morality. The man described by these records did not resemble him at all. Grief returned with force, sharpened now by anger. For years she had accepted the narrative offered to her because it had been easier than interrogating loss. Now the loss rearranged itself, no longer a private sorrow but a public injustice. She closed the ledger and sat very still, long hair slipping loose from its pins, the room suddenly too small for what she now carried. Fear followed quickly, not of discovery, but of implication. If Graymore had engineered her father's disgrace, then the pressure she felt now was not incidental. It was continuation. She brought the matter to Sebastian that evening, choosing her words carefully, presenting facts rather than accusations. He listened without interruption, his attention absolute. When she finished, he did not reassure her. He did not claim certainty. Instead, he acknowledged the pattern and offered resources with deliberate restraint, access to records, to people who might remember what others had forgotten. Arabella accepted the assistance but insisted on setting the pace. This was her history. She would not surrender it, even to him. Sebastian respected the boundary. The decision altered something between them, shifting their connection from alignment to collaboration. He followed where she led, his questions sharpening her focus rather than redirecting it. The balance steadied her. She realized then that what unsettled her most was not the threat of Graymore, but the possibility that truth might require her to step fully into conflict rather than merely endure it. That night, Arabella slept poorly, her mind circling dates and names, but beneath the unease lay something newly solid. She was no longer guessing. She was no longer alone in suspicion. The season had given her a role she had not sought, a woman under scrutiny, but the truth offered another, a woman with cause. And that, she understood, changed everything. The garden offered a temporary illusion of privacy, its clipped hedges and gravel paths arranged to suggest seclusion without ever truly providing it. Arabella welcomed the quiet nonetheless. She walked slowly, her thoughts still tethered to the ledger hidden safely away, the truth it suggested pressing against her composure. When Sebastian joined her, his presence was unobtrusive, his pace matching hers without comment. For a time, they spoke of inconsequence, the weather, the way the season seemed to accelerate as summer approached, until the silence between them grew too deliberate to ignore. Sebastian was the one who shifted it. He stopped near a stone bench, turning to face her fully. There was no impatience in his expression, only a gravity she had come to recognize as the precursor to honesty. He told her, carefully, that he had always understood the rules of the season as efficient rather than fair. They preserved order. They rewarded predictability. He had accepted that logic for most of his life, believing that distance was the cost of authority. Then he paused, his gaze steady on hers, and admitted something he rarely offered even to himself. He had never bent those rules for anyone before. The words landed with quiet force. Arabella felt their weight not as a declaration, but as an acknowledgement of risk. She understood what it cost him to say it aloud, how it stripped away the plausible deniability he relied upon. He did not dress the admission in sentiment. He did not name what lay beneath it. Yet she heard the restraint holding back something far less orderly. For a moment, the garden seemed to contract around them, every sound sharpened by awareness. Arabella answered with equal care. She told him she did not know what she would uncover, only that she could no longer accept the version of her father's life that had been handed to her. She would not ask him to protect her from the consequences of that pursuit. If he remained involved, it would be because he chose to stand beside her, not in front of her. Sebastian listened, then inclined his head in agreement, accepting terms that recognized her authority over her own story. The gesture felt intimate in its restraint. They stood close enough now that Arabella could sense his warmth, the disciplined stillness he imposed on himself. For an instant, she wondered what it would feel like if he abandoned it. The thought unsettled her more than any threat Greymore might pose. She stepped back, reclaiming space not as retreat but as preservation. Sebastian did not follow. He respected the boundary as he had every other. When they parted, nothing had been promised, yet the shape of their alliance had changed. It was no longer provisional. It was chosen. Arabella walked away with her resolve intact, and something else newly awakened, a recognition that whatever she uncovered would test not only the season's rules, but the limits of the restraint that bound her to the man who had begun, without intending to change them for her alone. The offer arrived through intermediaries, which was how Arabella knew it had been designed to feel inevitable. It was presented as kindness, as rescue disguised by propriety. A gentleman of acceptable lineage, steady income, and unremarkable temperament expressed interest in making her acquaintance more formally. He was safe, he was courteous, he was, in every way that mattered to the season, suitable. House of Greymore's influence hovered just beneath the surface of the proposal, visible in the eagerness with which it was endorsed and the speed with which it traveled. The message was clear. This was the path chosen for her. All she had to do was consent. Arabella met the suggestion with outward calm and inward suffocation. The safety offered felt like a narrowing corridor, its walls lined with expectations she would be required to meet without ever shaping them. She recognized the strategy at once. Remove her quietly from contention, settle her into obscurity, end whatever disruption she represented before it spread further. The man himself was not cruel. That made the trap more insidious. Politeness, she had learned, was often the sharpest instrument of control. Sebastian learned of the maneuver the same way he learned most things, through patterns that broke too neatly to be coincidence. His reaction was immediate and entirely unguarded, a flash of irritation that surprised even him. He said little when the matter was raised in conversation, but the stillness that followed was not neutral. Arabella noticed. She noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his restraint sharpened rather than soothed. Jealousy, when it appeared, did not announce itself loudly. It altered posture, it tightened silence. When they spoke privately later, Sebastian did not attempt to dissuade her with argument. He asked instead how she felt about the offer. The question was deliberate, granting her ownership of the decision rather than assuming authority over it. Arabella told him the truth. She said it felt like being asked to disappear politely. She said she would rather risk censure than accept a life arranged to make others comfortable. Sebastian absorbed the words without interruption. His expression softened, not with relief, but with recognition. The unspoken bond between them tightened, tested now by the reality that choosing freedom would mean rejecting certainty. Neither named what lay beneath the exchange. They did not need to. It lived in the way Sebastian's gaze lingered, in the way Arabella held his without apology. The season, efficient as ever, waited for her compliance. It had no contingency for refusal. When Arabella declined the offer the following day, she did so without explanation. The response was immediate. Whispers sharpened, approval cooled, consequences began to gather. Yet beneath the pressure, Arabella felt something steadier than fear. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had clarified the line she would not cross. Sebastian watched the fallout with a control that cost him more than he admitted. For the first time, the season's rules felt less like structure and more like provocation. And Arabella, standing firm in her refusal, understood that the safest path had never been the one that led away from danger. It had always been the one that allowed her to remain herself. The ball arrived with the kind of grandeur designed to erase uncertainty. Chandeliers burned bright enough to flatten shadows, music swelled to fill every pause, and the room itself seemed to breathe in unison, prepared to witness something worth remembering. Arabella entered with measured steps, acutely aware of the borrowed nature of everything she wore. The gown had been lent by a distant acquaintance, fitted expertly but still carrying the faint awareness that it would never truly be hers. Her long hair was arranged with care, soft rather than elaborate, framing her face without pretense. She felt composed, but exposed, every whisper brushing against her like a hand testing boundaries. The murmurs began almost immediately. Speculation traveled faster than greeting, curiosity sharpened by her recent refusals. Some watched with thinly veiled anticipation, as though waiting for her to falter under the weight of attention she had dared to invite. Arabella kept her expression serene, her posture exact. If the room meant to assess her, she would not give it anything careless to measure. The music shifted, signaling the opening set, and with it came the moment she would remember long after the night ended. Duke Sebastian Viamont crossed the floor without hesitation. He did not scan the room. He did not slow. He stopped directly before her and offered his hand with the same composure he brought to matters of consequence. "May I?" he said quietly, the request formal and unmistakably public. The room stilled. Arabella felt the weight of the choice before her. Acceptance would place her directly beneath the ton's collective gaze, aligning her openly with a man powerful enough to change her circumstances and dangerous enough to provoke resentment. Refusal would undo weeks of resolve in a single gesture. She did not look away. She placed her hand in his, her fingers steady, and inclined her head in agreement. The decision was hers. The consequence would be shared. As they took their place, Arabella became acutely aware of how many eyes followed them, how many assumptions were made in silence. Sebastian's hand at her waist was restrained, exact, offering guidance without possession. When the music began, she moved with him instinctively, letting rhythm replace thought. The dance was not intimate, but it was deliberate. Each step reinforced the fact of their alignment. He had chosen her in full view of the room, without explanation or apology. Arabella felt both elevated and unsettled. To be chosen was not the same as being claimed, yet the distinction mattered little to those watching. She understood now that this was not merely a kindness. It was a declaration of proximity that could not be retracted. The season recalibrated around them, curiosity hardening into calculation. When the set ended, Sebastian released her hand with the same control he had shown all evening. No smile lingered, no reassurance passed between them, none was needed. The statement had been made. Arabella returned to the edge of the room altered, not by fantasy but by fact. Whatever followed, she would not face it unseen. The Duke had chosen her openly. The room had borne witness, and nothing would be arranged the same way again. The letter arrived the morning after the ball, folded with care and sealed in wax that bore no crest. That, more than its presence, unsettled Arabella. Anonymous warnings were rarely empty. They were designed to feel inevitable. She broke the seal slowly, her long hair loose about her shoulders, the quiet of the room amplifying the sound of paper against paper. The message inside was brief and precisely worded. It spoke of her father's past with false gentleness, suggesting that certain misunderstandings could be revisited publicly if Arabella continued to draw attention to herself. It did not threaten her directly. It did not need to. It promised that history, once reopened, could be reshaped to ruin what little dignity she had reclaimed. Her guardian arrived shortly after, summoned not by her, but by rumor. He read the letter in silence, his expression tightening with a concern that rang hollow. He advised compliance in the language of reason, urging her to step back from society for a time, to allow matters to cool. The implication was unmistakable. If she withdrew now, the season would forgive her. If she remained, it would devour her. Arabella listened without interrupting, her hands steady despite the familiar tightening in her chest. Fear rose, sharp and insistent, but she refused to let it dictate her response. She folded the letter and set it aside, making a decision she had already reached. She sought Sebastian out that afternoon, choosing a setting quiet enough to allow honesty without audience. When she showed him the letter, he read it once, then again, his expression hardening into something controlled and dangerous. He did not rage. He did not curse Greymore aloud. Instead, he spoke with a gravity that bordered on vow. He told her that whatever they attempted next would not be without consequence, and that he would not ask her to shoulder it alone. The offer was not framed as rescue. It was framed as alignment. Arabella felt the weight of it keenly. She understood what accepting his protection might cost him, how easily it could be recast as impropriety or manipulation. She also understood the danger of refusing out of pride. She told him the truth. She said she would not retreat, but she would not hide behind his name either. If she was to face the threat, it would be with clarity rather than concealment. Sebastian accepted the boundary without protest. The restraint in his agreement felt more intimate than reassurance. As they parted, Arabella sensed how close they stood to a line neither had yet crossed. The letter lay folded in her glove like a challenge, its threat now sharpened by defiance. She realized then that Graymore had misjudged her. Fear might have silenced her once. Now it only clarified her resolve. If they intended to resurrect lies, she would answer with truth, and if the season meant to punish her for refusing erasure, she would endure the cost openly. The investigation began without ceremony, which suited Arabella. She learned quickly that truth rarely announced itself in grand revelations. It emerged in fragments, in the margins of old records and the half-remembered testimony of those who had learned to forget for their own survival. Sebastian facilitated access without intruding, opening doors that would have remained sealed to her alone, then stepping back to allow her to lead. The balance mattered. This was her history being unearthed, not a favor performed on her behalf. They worked quietly, meeting in borrowed libraries and unused sitting rooms, their conversations low and precise. Arabella read with careful attention, tracing inconsistencies others had overlooked because they required patience rather than authority. Dates failed to align. Transactions appeared where no purpose was recorded. Again and again, the same pattern surfaced: money redirected, blame reassigned, silence purchased. House of Graymore lingered behind each discovery like a shadow that could not be shaken. The realization settled heavily. Her father had not merely been ruined, he had been used. Grief returned in waves, sharper now for its clarity. Arabella felt anger rise alongside it, but she did not allow either to overwhelm her focus. Each finding was catalogued, cross-referenced, protected. Sebastian watched the discipline with something approaching reverence. He offered insight when asked, strategy when necessary, but never attempted to steer her conclusions. His respect became a constant, grounding presence, and Arabella found she relied on it more than she had expected. One evening, the evidence spread between them on a table lit low and warm, the weight of what they had uncovered pressed close. Arabella spoke of her father not as a victim, but as a man who had believed in rules he assumed would protect him. The betrayal lay not only in the theft, but in the lie that order equaled justice. Sebastian listened without interruption, his expression unreadable until she finished. Then he acknowledged what she had not said aloud, that exposing Graymore would provoke retaliation. Power rarely surrendered quietly. They stood closer than intended, the space between them narrowed by shared purpose and unspoken feeling. Arabella felt the awareness of him like a held breath. For a moment, she wondered what would happen if restraint failed them both. The thought unsettled her enough to step back, re-establishing distance not as rejection but as preservation. Sebastian did not follow. He recognized the necessity of the boundary and honored it without question. As they parted, Arabella carried with her a steadier grief and a clearer aim. The truth they were assembling would not restore what had been lost, but it would strip away the lie that had defined her father's end. The season had taught her how easily narratives were shaped by those with influence. Now she understood how they could be unmade. House of Graymore had believed time would erase its tracks. Arabella intended to prove that patience, properly applied, could be far more dangerous than haste. The supper was intended to appear informal, which was how Arabella recognized its danger. Intimacy, when staged, created opportunities for precision that public rooms did not. The table was small enough to force proximity, the guest list curated to suggest ease rather than scrutiny. House of Graymore's presence was subtle but unmistakable, embedded in the choice of companions and the careful neutrality of the setting. Arabella arrived prepared, her long hair pinned back with deliberate restraint, her expression composed to the point of stillness. She understood that this evening would not be about conversation, it would be about placement. The insult came disguised as observation, a remark about lineage delivered with a faint smile, a suggestion that resilience often compensated for lack. The words were not aimed directly at her, which made them sharper. The table fell quiet, waiting to see whether she would accept the diminishment or reveal herself by objecting. Arabella felt the familiar pressure gather, the instinct to endure rather than disrupt. She chose neither. She met the moment with silence, allowing the remark to linger long enough to expose itself. Sebastian intervened with surgical calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend Arabella explicitly. Instead, he reframed the conversation with such exactness that the original speaker was left without footing. He cited precedent, corrected an assumption, and redirected attention with authority that allowed no reply. The effect was immediate. The room recalibrated, laughter returning where it was safe to laugh, the matter closed without spectacle. Power, when exercised precisely, required no emphasis. Arabella felt the impact keenly. Not relief. She had learned not to rely on that, but recognition. Sebastian had not acted from impulse. He had chosen the moment, weighed the cost, and enforced consequence with intention. The defense was not performative, it was definitive. She understood then that his restraint was not hesitation, it was control refined to a blade's edge. The remainder of the evening passed without further provocation, but the damage had been done. Greymoor's representative watched with a narrowed gaze, recalculating. Arabella remained outwardly unchanged, yet something within her had shifted. She was unsettled not by the insult, but by the power used on her behalf. To be defended so cleanly was to be seen fully, and that visibility carried its own risk. When they departed, Sebastian did not speak of what had occurred. He did not offer reassurance or explanation. The absence of commentary was deliberate, allowing Arabella the space to interpret the event on her own terms. As they parted, their eyes met briefly, acknowledgement passing between them without softening. Alone later, Arabella considered the evening with careful clarity. The season had tested her again, and she had not flinched, yet she could no longer pretend that the danger lay solely in exclusion. Attraction, allied with power, carried consequences that reached far beyond the moment. She felt the pull of it now, unmistakable and perilous. The slow, burned tension she had disciplined so carefully was no longer theoretical. It had been given form, sharpened by choice, and the cost of ignoring it would only increase from here. The invitation arrived on heavy paper, embossed and formal, its tone carefully neutral. Arabella recognized it at once, as a test rather than an honor. Attendance would signal acceptance. Refusal would confirm suspicion. She prepared for the evening with quiet resolve, her long hair arranged simply, refusing ornament that might be interpreted as ambition. The carriage ride passed in measured silence, each turn of the wheels tightening her focus. She understood now how these moments were engineered, not to exclude outright, but to humiliate through procedure. At the door, the slight was delivered with professional courtesy. A pause, a glance at the list, a murmured apology for a regrettable oversight. Arabella felt the heat of attention gather behind her as others waited to enter. For a heartbeat, the old instinct to absorb the insult rose, to accept inconvenience as the price of survival. She stilled it. This was no accident. This was instruction. She stepped aside without protest, her expression composed, her spine straight, humiliation threatened, sharp and public, but she did not allow it purchase. The doorman looked relieved, already turning away. That was when Sebastian arrived. He took in the scene with a single glance, his expression unreadable. He did not ask what had occurred. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he addressed the host directly, his tone measured and absolute. He stated, plainly, that an invitation extended and then revoked was meaningless. He added, with equal calm, that he would not attend an event conducted on such terms. The words carried no anger, only consequence. The effect was immediate. Confusion flickered. Apologies surfaced. The door reopened. Arabella stepped forward again, not as a concession but as a fact. She entered beside Sebastian, not behind him, her presence restored publicly and without explanation. The room adjusted in real time, whispers rushing to recalibrate what had just been witnessed. She felt the reversal like a physical shift, humiliation transmuted into something steadier. Dignity reclaimed was not louder than dignity denied, but it was infinitely more enduring. Throughout the evening, Arabella moved with renewed clarity. She spoke where she chose, listened where it served her, and did not soften herself to reassure those unsettled by her presence. Sebastian did not hover. He remained visible enough to confirm alignment, distant enough to preserve her agency. The balance was exacting, deliberate, and unmistakable. When the night ended, the story was already circulating. Not that Arabella had been excluded, but that exclusion had failed. The distinction mattered. The season had learned, reluctantly, that erasure was no longer assured. Arabella understood the cost of the lesson, and she accepted it willingly. As she returned home, fatigue settled in, tempered by something steadier than triumph. She had not been spared cruelty. She had survived it in real time. More than that, She had witnessed how power could be used not to shield her from the world, but to force the world to account for itself. The realization was sobering and dangerous. The rules had not vanished. They had bent again, and the strain of that bend would soon demand reckoning. The confrontation with her guardian did not arrive dramatically. It came in the form of a quiet request to speak, delivered with the same careful politeness that had always concealed obligation as concern. Arabella agreed, already sensing what would be revealed. They sat across from one another in a modest sitting room, the space too familiar to offer comfort. Her long hair was unpinned, falling loosely down her back, an unconscious refusal of formality. She wanted truth, not performance. He spoke at length before saying anything of substance, circling the matter with practiced ease. Then, at last, he admitted it. The debts had not been incidental. They had accumulated over years, quietly, deliberately, until House of Greymore owned more than his finances. They owned his silence. His authority over Arabella had been the currency with which he paid what he could not otherwise afford. Each restriction he placed on her life had been justified as prudence, each withheld opportunity framed as protection. In truth, it had been leverage. Arabella felt the betrayal with cold clarity rather than shock. The knowledge settled into place, explaining too much to be denied. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She asked one question only: how long? When he answered, the distance between them became absolute. Whatever affection had once existed could not survive the precision of the harm done. When Sebastian learned of it, his reaction was immediate and controlled to the point of severity. He offered Arabella an exit without conditions: resources, distance, anonymity if she wished it. Safety, framed not as escape but as choice. Arabella listened, then refused. Flight would leave the truth intact. It would allow Greymore to continue shaping her life from a distance. She would not trade one form of control for another, however gently offered. Sebastian accepted her decision without argument. The respect in his agreement mattered more than any promise of protection. He adjusted his approach at once, offering support without strategy, presence without direction. Arabella recognized the shift and felt steadied by it. This was not rescue. This was alignment on terms she had chosen. In the days that followed, Arabella reclaimed what authority she could, setting boundaries with a clarity that allowed no negotiation. Her guardian's influence receded, weakened by exposure, and her refusal to comply further. The season took note, quietly. Women like Arabella were expected to endure betrayal, not confront it. Each refusal sharpened her reputation into something difficult to categorize. As pressure mounted, Arabella felt the strain of constant vigilance. Yet beneath it ran a steadier current. She was no longer reacting to hidden forces. They had names now: debts, lies, power exercised in shadows. She understood the field clearly enough to choose her ground. Sebastian remained beside her, not as shield but as witness. Their conversations grew quieter, more charged, each shaped by what they did not yet allow themselves to say. Arabella sensed the turning point approaching, inevitable and dangerous. The truths they were uncovering could no longer be contained by discretion alone. When Greymore moved next, and they would, it would not be quietly. And Arabella would meet it standing, no longer managed, no longer owned, and no longer alone. The discovery came late, when the house had settled into the kind of silence that made every sound feel deliberate. Arabella had returned to her father's effects once more, driven less by expectation than by a refusal to leave any corner unexamined. Grief had taught her patience. She worked slowly, her long hair falling forward, as she knelt beside a trunk she had opened and closed a dozen times already. It was beneath a false lining, cleverly stitched, easily missed, that she found it at last. A small, sealed packet, a signet she had not seen since childhood, and a folded note, its ink faded but its intent unmistakable. The contents did not shout, they did not accuse outright. They simply aligned too perfectly with what she had already learned to be coincidence. Names matched accounts, dates matched absences. A transaction, long denied, was acknowledged in her father's careful hand, not as confession but as warning. He had known he was being cornered. He had believed, fatally, that order would prevail if he kept records precise enough to be undeniable. Arabella's breath caught as understanding settled. Her father had not been careless. He had been methodical to the end. Tears came then, swift and uncontained, grief breaking through resolve with sudden force. Arabella pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, refusing to let sound escape, as though restraint itself might honor him. When the wave passed, what remained was not fragility but steel. This was not enough on its own. It was not yet proof that could withstand scrutiny. But it was a key, and keys were meant to open doors. Sebastian arrived soon after, summoned not by panic but by clarity. Arabella showed him what she had found without embellishment, allowing the weight of it to speak for itself. He examined the items with careful attention, his expression shifting into something intent and controlled. He did not celebrate. He did not reassure. He acknowledged what mattered, that this was the missing thread they had been circling, the piece that made intention visible rather than inferred. They stood close in the lamplit room, the air charged by shared purpose and unspoken feeling. Arabella felt the awareness of him acutely, the steadiness he offered without intrusion. For a moment, the distance between restraint and surrender narrowed dangerously. She wondered what it would cost to cross it, and what it might cost not to. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, distant but enough to break the moment. She stepped back first, re-establishing space with deliberate calm. Sebastian did not reach for her. He respected the boundary as he had every other, though the tension remained, unresolved and sharpened by proximity to truth. As he left, Arabella secured the packet with care, understanding fully what she now carried. The evidence was not complete, but it was enough to change the shape of what followed. For the first time since her father's death, Arabella felt the balance tilt. Greymoor's power had relied on silence and assumption. She now possessed something that resisted both. Whatever came next would be dangerous. It would be public, and it would demand more than endurance. It would demand that she stand in the open and speak. Greymoor moved with the efficiency of those accustomed to control. The rumor appeared before Arabella could decide how to deploy what she had found, seeded quietly and cultivated with patience. It did not accuse her directly. It did not need to. It suggested impropriety through proximity, a narrative shaped to make her credibility feel fragile rather than false. A corridor. A moment alone. The implication that discretion had been abandoned. The season understood such stories well. They did not require proof. They required repetition. Arabella sensed the shift immediately. Conversations stalled when she entered rooms. Invitations arrived with cautious phrasing or not at all. She felt eyes linger with a new appraisal, not curious now but evaluative, measuring how much damage could be done without consequence. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Greymoor had chosen its moment deliberately, striking before she could move first. Sebastian confronted the matter without delay. He did not pretend surprise. He understood the mechanics at work as well as she did. His response was swift, controlled, and framed as solution. He offered a way to end the speculation decisively, an action that would absorb the scandal into duty, transforming rumor into respectability by force of convention. The proposal was precise, honorable, and costly. It would shield Arabella completely. It would also require sacrifice from him that could not be reclaimed. Arabella listened in silence, recognizing the weight of what he offered. She heard the care beneath the calculation, the feeling he continued to refuse to name, and she refused the solution just as carefully. To accept would be to allow Greymoor to dictate the terms of her life once more, merely exchanging one form of containment for another. She would not be pressed into safety by threat. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. The refusal was not angry. It was steady. Arabella told him she would not be cornered into a future chosen by scandal, however protective the intent. She said she trusted him, but she trusted herself as well. Sebastian absorbed the decision without argument, the tension in his restraint deepening rather than fracturing. He honored her choice, even as it cost him something unspoken. The days that followed were difficult. The rumor did not vanish. It lingered, feeding on uncertainty. Yet Arabella held her course, her composure unbroken, her long hair arranged with deliberate simplicity, her presence unchanged. She would not shrink. Each appearance became an act of defiance through steadiness alone. Those inclined to doubt her found no spectacle to justify it. Sebastian adjusted his approach, remaining visible but not possessive, allowing her autonomy to speak louder than defense. The strategy was risky, but it was honest. Together, they endured the pressure without capitulation, allowing the lie to exhaust itself against her consistency. Arabella understood now that this was the season's most dangerous weapon, not exclusion, but distortion. To be seen incorrectly was to be erased slowly. She would not allow it. The truth she carried would soon surface, and when it did, the rumor would be revealed for what it was, a last, desperate attempt to discredit a woman who had refused to be managed. Arabella made her refusal public not through declaration, but through consistency. She did not hide. She did not retreat into careful absence. She attended what invitations remained, arrived precisely on time, and conducted herself with the same measured composure that had carried her through every earlier test. Her long hair was arranged simply, neither softened to invite sympathy nor sharpened to provoke defiance. If the season meant to read her, it would find no flourish to misinterpret. She offered only steadiness, and steadiness, she had learned, unnerved those who relied on distortion. Privately, the pressure tightened. Suggestions arrived cloaked as concern. Friends of convenience advised prudence, urged her to consider the comfort of resolution. Each word implied the same conclusion, that a decisive attachment would quiet speculation, that safety lay in absorption. Arabella listened and declined, again and again, refusing to be maneuvered by fear dressed as wisdom. She understood the calculus being offered: surrender a measure of self now to preserve the whole later. It was a bargain she no longer accepted. Survival without selfhood was not preservation. It was erasure postponed. Sebastian watched the strain with restraint that cost him more than he admitted. He did not repeat his earlier proposal. He did not press. Instead, he made space, literal and figurative, ensuring her autonomy remained visible even as scrutiny intensified. The choice demanded discipline. It required him to trust not only her resolve, but the efficacy of restraint over intervention. That trust, once given, deepened his regard into something fierce and quiet. They spoke less of the rumor and more of strategy, redirecting focus to the evidence they continued to assemble. Arabella's mind sharpened under pressure, her observations precise, her decisions increasingly confident. She realized, with a kind of astonished calm, that she was no longer afraid of the season's displeasure. What unsettled her now was the clarity with which she saw it. The mechanisms were familiar, almost dull in their predictability. Fear was a tool. Compliance was the aim. One afternoon, alone at her escritoire, Arabella acknowledged the truth she had been circling. The refusal had changed her. She no longer measured her choices by the comfort they offered others. She measured them by their alignment with who she intended to remain. The recognition steadied her more than any assurance could have. She was not merely enduring. She was choosing repeatedly, in full knowledge of consequence. When she next encountered Sebastian, the air between them carried a new weight, not urgency, but inevitability. He did not praise her courage. He did not soften his gaze. He met her with something like reverence, the kind reserved for resolve that does not ask to be admired. In that look, Arabella saw her own strength reflected back without possession or claim. The season continued its murmured judgments, but they no longer defined the field. Arabella had drawn a line that could not be crossed without exposure. Whatever Greymore attempted next would have to contend not with a woman cornered by rumor, but with one who had refused to be saved at the cost of herself. The reckoning, she sensed, was approaching, and she would meet it standing. The offer came wrapped in velvet civility, delivered with a smile that suggested generosity rather than expectation. A duchess whose favor could open rooms and close reputations invited Arabella for tea, the summons framed as kindness extended to a woman navigating unnecessary difficulty. Arabella arrived on time, composed, her long hair pinned with deliberate restraint, already aware that patronage was rarely offered without terms. The drawing room was arranged to impress without ostentation, every detail calibrated to remind a visitor of the power seated opposite her. The Duchess spoke warmly of opportunity, of guidance, of how easily missteps could be softened with the right influence. She praised Arabella's composure, her intelligence, her promise, and then named the price without naming it: obedience, discretion, gratitude expressed through alignment rather than words. Arabella understood immediately what was being proposed: protection in exchange for silence, visibility curated, choices narrowed until they resembled freedom only from a distance. She listened carefully, allowing the full shape of the offer to reveal itself. When she declined, she did so with courtesy unmarred by hesitation. She said she was grateful for the attention, but she was not seeking guardianship. The Duchess's smile cooled, not into anger, but into appraisal, recalculating where Arabella now stood. The refusal carried consequence. Arabella felt it settle as she took her leave, aware that a door had closed behind her, even as others might open later. Sebastian learned of the meeting through the same channels that carried everything of note. When Arabella told him herself, She did not soften the truth. She named the cost of refusal and accepted it fully. He did not attempt to mitigate the fallout. Instead, he regarded her with a new intensity, admiration stripped of abstraction. To refuse safety when it was offered so smoothly required a courage the season neither expected nor rewarded. In the days that followed, Arabella felt the withdrawal keenly. Invitations thinned, support cooled. Yet something unexpected occurred alongside the loss. Women she had spoken with only briefly began to seek her out, quietly, without announcement. They recognized something in her refusal that mirrored their own private compromises. Conversations shifted. Confidence gathered. Arabella discovered that influence did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moved through recognition alone. Sebastian watched the change with careful attention. He saw her confidence take root independent of his name, her presence altering rooms without requiring his intervention. Pride stirred, accompanied by a flicker of fear. Power, once claimed, did not always remain contained. He understood then that Arabella was no longer merely navigating the season. She was reshaping it from within, quietly, deliberately, and on her own terms. One evening, as they stood together at the edge of a gathering, Sebastian admitted what he had not before, that watching her choose herself had unsettled him more than any threat Greymore had made. Arabella met the admission without surprise. She had felt the shift too. The ground between them had changed, not through declaration, but through accumulated choice. The season pressed on, but Arabella no longer measured her worth by its approval. She had refused patronage, refused containment, and in doing so, discovered a steadier form of power. Whatever came next would test it. She welcomed the test, knowing now that she was no longer alone, and no longer willing to be shaped by anyone else's fear. The clerk agreed to meet them only after dusk, his message delivered through two intermediaries, and a pause long enough to suggest fear rather than inconvenience. Arabella understood the hesitation. Those who survived powerful houses did so by perfecting disappearance. She arrived at the modest residence with her composure intact, her long hair braided and pinned back, practical rather than ornamental. This was not a night for display, it was a night for listening. The man who admitted them was older than Arabella had expected, his shoulders rounded by years of vigilance. His eyes flicked toward the street before he closed the door, as though Greymore's reach might extend through brick and shadow. Sebastian remained a step behind Arabella, present but unobtrusive, allowing her to lead. The choice steadied her. This testimony, if it came at all, would be given to her, not extracted by power. They spoke quietly, the clerk's words cautious, fragmentary at first. He did not offer grand confessions. He spoke of altered entries, of ledgers corrected after the fact, of instructions delivered verbally so nothing improper could be traced. When Arabella asked about her father, the man hesitated longer than before. Then he confirmed what they had suspected, that blame had been redirected deliberately, that her father's refusal to cooperate had made him useful as a shield. The admission landed with a weight that tightened Arabella's chest. It was not dramatic, it was precise, and it was devastating. As the account unfolded, danger took on a different texture. This was no longer a matter of social pressure alone. Records had been falsified, careers destroyed, silence enforced through fear. Arabella realized that exposing Greymore would provoke more than gossip. It would invite retaliation from those invested in the lie's survival. The risk sharpened her focus, rather than blunting it. She asked questions carefully, allowing the clerk to speak without interruption, anchoring him with attention rather than urgency. Sebastian's protectiveness surfaced in small ways. When the clerk's voice faltered, Sebastian moved closer, not to dominate the exchange, but to lend weight to Arabella's presence. At one point, his hand covered hers briefly on the table, a deliberate touch meant to steady rather than claim. Arabella did not withdraw. The contact grounded her, a reminder that restraint could also be a form of care. When they left, the night felt altered, the air heavier with consequence. Arabella walked in silence, her thoughts aligning around what had been confirmed. The truth was no longer theoretical. It had witnesses. It had memory. It had cost. She felt fear, yes, but beneath it, resolve held firm. This was the line beyond which Greymore could not retreat quietly. Sebastian spoke only once as they parted, acknowledging the danger without dramatizing it. He told her he would follow her lead in what came next. The words mattered more than reassurance. Arabella understood now that she was no longer assembling suspicion. She was assembling proof. And proof, once gathered, demanded action. The drawing room was too warm, the air thick with politeness and calculation. Arabella recognized the danger the moment she realized who else had been invited. Greymore's heir stood near the window, posture relaxed, expression arranged into something that might have passed for charm if she had not learned to read the precision beneath it. The gathering was small enough to discourage interruption, the exits positioned just far enough away to require deliberation. This was no coincidence. It was a setting designed to apply pressure without witnesses. When he approached her, his tone was courteous, his words chosen carefully to sound flattering rather than coercive. He spoke of concern for her future, of how easily uncertainty could be resolved with the right alliance. Each sentence narrowed the space around her, implying inevitability without ever naming force. Arabella felt fear flicker, sharp and immediate, but she did not allow it to surface. She had endured too much to mistake civility for safety now. She responded with restraint, declining his suggestions without confrontation, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. The heir's smile tightened, the conversation shifted, the implication growing clearer. He hinted at arrangements already discussed, futures imagined without her consent, reputations that could be stabilized or destroyed, depending on her compliance. The threat lay not in volume but in certainty. This was how Greymore claimed what it wanted, by convincing others there was no alternative. Arabella felt controlled fury rise, precise and cold. She understood then that silence would be interpreted as weakness and politeness as permission. She spoke clearly, naming nothing but refusing everything. She said she was not available to be arranged. She said her future was not negotiable. The room seemed to contract around the words. For a breath, she wondered whether restraint alone would be enough. Sebastian intervened before the moment could sharpen further. He approached without haste, his presence altering the balance instantly. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He simply joined the conversation and redirected it with a civility that left no doubt about consequence. His words were measured, his tone calm, but the warning beneath them was unmistakable. Whatever had been implied would not be pursued without response. The heir stepped back, recalculating. The encounter ended without spectacle, but its meaning was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. Arabella felt the aftermath keenly, not relief, but clarity. This was no longer a matter of rumor or leverage applied at a distance. Greymore was willing to exert pressure directly, to claim her autonomy as collateral. Later, alone, Arabella acknowledged what the encounter had revealed. Sebastian's restraint was not weakness, it was choice, carefully exercised. He possessed force enough to end the matter publicly, yet he had held it in reserve, allowing her refusal to stand on its own authority. The respect in that decision mattered more than intervention. The season continued its measured pace, but Arabella felt the field shift beneath her feet. The threat had been made plain. The distance between social maneuvering and personal danger had narrowed. Whatever came next would not remain contained within drawing rooms and whispered implication. Greymore had stepped into the open, and Arabella, no longer willing to be cornered quietly, prepared to meet what followed with equal clarity. Sebastian did not speak of his family until the pressure made silence impractical. It was an evening stripped of ornament, the kind that encouraged truth by offering nowhere for it to hide. They stood near a window overlooking the street, the city murmuring beyond the glass, indifferent to bloodlines and expectation. Arabella sensed the shift before he spoke, the subtle tightening of his restraint, the way he measured his words not for effect, but for consequence. He told her, plainly, what his position demanded. Alliances were expected, not suggested. Bloodlines were currency, not sentiment. His family had tolerated deviation when it served advantage, but patience had limits, and House of Greymore had been quick to exploit them. An offer had been made, an alliance through a distant cousin, framed as reconciliation, stability, and mutual benefit. It was a solution tidy enough to please those who believed order mattered more than justice. Accepting it would quiet speculation, secure influence, and restore predictability. Arabella felt the familiar narrative rise at once. She was the disruption. She was the variable to be eliminated. The story had been told to women like her for generations, and it had always ended the same way. Step aside, be grateful, disappear gracefully. For a moment, the weight of it pressed hard enough to steal her breath. Then she refused it, not aloud, but inwardly, with the same certainty that had guided every other choice she had made. She told Sebastian the truth without ornament. She said she would not allow herself to be cast as an obstacle to be removed, nor would she accept affection shadowed by compromise. If he chose duty, she would not resent him for it, but she would not diminish herself to make the choice easier. The words were steady, stripped of plea or accusation. They carried risk. She knew that. She offered them anyway. Sebastian absorbed the response in silence. He did not argue. He did not reassure. When he spoke again, it was to acknowledge the lie she had named, that worth was not determined by bloodline, nor legitimacy by convenience. He admitted that the expectation placed upon him had always felt immutable, until it collided with her refusal to accept erasure. The admission was not romantic. It was honest, and that made it far more intimate. They stood closer than before, not through movement but through recognition. Arabella felt the awareness of him keenly, the gravity of choice tightening the air between them. This was the boundary neither could cross lightly. Intimacy, if it came, would demand sacrifice from them both. Neither pretended otherwise. When they parted, nothing had been resolved, yet something essential had been clarified. Arabella returned home with her dignity intact and her resolve sharpened. She would not negotiate her worth, not for safety, not for love, not even for him. The season had taught her many lessons, but this one she had learned on her own terms. Sebastian remained by the window long after she left, the city's lights reflected in the glass like unanswered questions. He understood now that the rules he had lived by were no longer sufficient. Whatever choice he made next would define not only his standing, but the man he was willing to be. Arabella began to notice the shift before anyone named it. It announced itself not in invitations or proclamations, but in glances held a fraction longer than courtesy required, in women who paused beside her chair as though drawn by something they had not expected to find. They spoke quietly at first, remarks exchanged under the cover of shared disinterest, questions framed as observations rather than confessions. Arabella listened more than she spoke, allowing recognition to do its work. She understood now that influence did not always move through declarations. Sometimes it gathered through permission, through the simple act of standing unashamed and letting others see it was possible. She chose her moments carefully, a word of support offered where it would not be overheard, a deliberate inclusion at a table arranged to exclude, a refusal to laugh when laughter was demanded. Each choice was small enough to avoid notice, but together they formed a pattern that unsettled those accustomed to directing the flow of rooms. Arabella did not frame herself as leader or savior. She offered steadiness, and steadiness, she discovered, was contagious. Women who had endured their own careful diminishment recognized it at once. The season responded with confusion rather than resistance. It had rules for rebellion and rules for compliance, but it had fewer for quiet authority that asked nothing in return. Arabella felt her confidence take root in ways she had not anticipated. It was no longer borrowed from proximity to power. It grew from alignment with herself. Her long hair was arranged as she pleased now, her posture easy without being careless, her presence grounded rather than defensive. She no longer entered rooms braced for impact. She entered them prepared to choose. Sebastian observed the change with attention sharpened by admiration and unease. He had expected her to endure, perhaps even to prevail through persistence. He had not expected her to become a point of gravity. Watching others orient themselves subtly toward her unsettled him in ways Greymoor's threats had not. Power, he understood. Influence wielded without spectacle challenged him more. He felt pride, unmistakable and dangerous, and beneath it a flicker of fear he did not immediately name. They spoke less often now, not from distance but from mutual awareness that their connection no longer required constant reinforcement. When they did meet, the conversations were quieter, their pauses heavier with what had been deferred rather than denied. Sebastian recognized that Arabella no longer needed his intervention to command a room. The realization humbled him. It also bound him more tightly, because choice, once freely exercised, could not be reclaimed through force. One evening, as they stood apart at the edge of a gathering, Sebastian admitted what had become impossible to ignore. He told her he was proud of her, not for what she had survived, but for what she had built without asking permission. Arabella accepted the acknowledgement without deflection. She had learned not to shrink from recognition any more than she expanded to solicit it. As the night drew on, Arabella felt the season press around her with renewed interest, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like terrain, imperfect, contested, navigable. She had not set out to lead. She had set out to remain herself. The difference mattered, and as she moved through the room, aware of eyes that followed her with something like hope, she understood that whatever reckoning awaited Greymoor would not find her standing alone. The attempt came quietly, which was how Arabella knew it had been planned by someone who understood patience. Nothing was taken outright. Nothing was confronted. Instead, a drawer left slightly ajar, papers subtly misaligned, the faint sense that order had been disturbed without obvious cause. Arabella noticed the changes at once. She had learned, through necessity, to trust the instinct that registered absence before it confirmed loss. The evidence remained where she had secured it, but the intrusion was unmistakable. Graymore was no longer content to wait. Rather than confront the breach, Arabella adjusted. She moved the most critical pieces not to deeper concealment, but into a place so ordinary it invited dismissal. The decision was deliberate. Those who searched for secrets expected cleverness. They rarely anticipated that truth would be hidden in plain sight, protected by its own unremarkable appearance. Arabella reorganized her papers with meticulous calm, her long hair braided back to keep it from falling forward as she worked, each movement purposeful, unhurried. Fear sharpened her focus rather than fracturing it. She was no longer guessing, she was anticipating. When she told Sebastian what had occurred, she did not dramatize it. She described the signs, the timing, the implications. He listened, then followed her lead without hesitation. The shift was subtle but decisive. Where once he might have proposed strategy, he now deferred, offering resources in response to her direction rather than ahead of it. The acknowledgement carried weight. Trust, once extended, rearranged the balance between them into something quieter and more exacting. They moved through the following days with heightened awareness, speaking little in public, exchanging understanding through brief looks and careful timing. Arabella found that she no longer felt the need to explain herself. Her decisions came with a confidence that did not seek approval. Sebastian recognized it and adjusted instinctively, his respect deepening into something bordering on reverence. To follow rather than lead did not diminish him. It clarified the nature of their alignment. The season, meanwhile, sensed disruption without yet identifying its source. Conversations shifted, glances sharpened. Those accustomed to controlling information found themselves uncertain where it now resided. Arabella moved through rooms with steady composure, offering nothing to interrogate. She understood now that power often revealed itself not through action, but through restraint, through knowing when not to react. Late one evening, as they reviewed what remained to be gathered, Sebastian spoke a truth that surprised them both. He told her that watching her command circumstance without spectacle had altered his understanding of authority. He had been trained to apply pressure, to enforce outcome. Arabella had shown him another way, to anticipate, to redirect, to let others exhaust themselves against patience. The admission carried intimacy without softness, respect without claim. As they parted, Arabella felt the quiet certainty of readiness settle within her. Graymore had attempted to seize control and failed without realizing it. The advantage had shifted, not through confrontation, but through preparation. Whatever came next would be more overt, more desperate. She welcomed it with a calm born of clarity. The truth was secure, the strategy sound, and for the first time since the season began, Arabella understood that she was not merely reacting to threat. She was setting the terms by which it would be answered. The accusation was delivered in a room chosen for its audience. Arabella understood that at once. The gathering was large enough to guarantee circulation, formal enough to lend credibility, and restrained enough to discourage interruption. When her father's name was spoken aloud, the effect was immediate. Conversation stilled. Attention turned. The season, always alert to spectacle, leaned forward in practiced anticipation. The claim itself was not new. It was simply louder. Graymore's representative framed it as clarification rather than attack, suggesting that certain past indiscretions had never been properly resolved. The implication was precise. Arabella's recent prominence was cast as reckless in light of unfinished history. The room waited for her response, the silence engineered to pressure her into visible distress or defensive haste. Arabella stepped forward alone. She did not look toward Sebastian. She did not seek reinforcement through proximity. Her long hair was arranged simply, her posture unyielding, her expression composed to the point of stillness. She spoke calmly, refusing the urgency the moment demanded. She did not deny the accusation immediately. She questioned it. She asked for specificity, dates, accounts, evidence. The tone of inquiry shifted the room, turning spectators into listeners. Precision, she had learned, was the enemy of insinuation. The representative faltered, forced to restate claims that had relied on assumption rather than proof. Arabella allowed the hesitation to register before continuing. She spoke of record, keeping, of discrepancies that had never been reconciled, of how convenient it was that blame had settled on a man no longer alive to contest it. She did not accuse Graymore outright. She did not need to. She made the absence of proof visible, and absence, when named, unsettled authority. Sebastian remained silent by design. He watched the room recalibrate, felt the tension tighten as Arabella claimed space without assistance. The choice cost him restraint, but he held to it. This was her moment. To interrupt would be to diminish what she was building in real time. When Arabella finished, the silence that followed was no longer anticipatory. It was uncertain. The accusation had been spoken, but it had not landed. The room shifted again, calculating where credibility now rested. Arabella stepped back, neither triumphant nor shaken. She had not won. She had opened a door that could not be closed quietly. Only then did Sebastian move. He did not address the accusation directly. He addressed process. He named the impropriety of raising unsubstantiated claims in a public forum. He suggested, calmly, that if such matters required resolution, they should be pursued through proper channels rather than spectacle. The intervention reframed the moment, transforming attack into breach of decorum. Authority, when aligned with restraint, carried its own weight. As conversation resumed in fractured pieces, Arabella felt the shift settle around her. The season had expected collapse. It had witnessed composure instead. The difference mattered. Graymore had chosen to strike publicly and had failed to control the narrative. Later, as Arabella withdrew from the room, she felt the familiar tremor of aftermath, adrenaline receding, awareness sharpening. She had stood alone and not fallen. The realization steadied her more than any reassurance could have. The lie had been spoken aloud at last. That was its weakness. Truth, once given room to breathe, rarely retreated again. The reaction did not arrive all at once. It rippled outward in increments, hesitation replacing certainty, murmurs shifting direction as the room recalculated what it had just witnessed. Arabella felt it in the way eyes lingered now, not with expectation of failure, but with curiosity edged by doubt. Graymore's accusation had been made aloud, but its authority had fractured under scrutiny. The silence that followed was no longer hostile. It was evaluative. Arabella remained where she stood, neither retreating nor advancing, allowing the weight of her words to settle without embellishment. She understood instinctively that overreach would undo what restraint had secured. Precision had been her shield. It would remain so. She watched as the representative attempted to recover ground, offering clarifications that sounded increasingly like repetition. Each attempt thinned the claim rather than strengthening it. The season had been trained to recognize confidence. What it was witnessing now was insistence without foundation. Only after the moment had shifted irreversibly did Arabella reach into her reticule. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand attention. She produced the first piece of evidence quietly, naming it for what it was, a contemporaneous record, unaltered, previously overlooked. The effect was immediate. The room leaned in, the difference between rumor and documentation registering at once. Arabella presented the material methodically, each reference exact, each implication allowed to form without being pushed. She did not accuse Graymore directly. She let alignment do the work. Dates matched, accounts conflicted, patterns emerged. Gasps followed, not dramatic, but restrained, the kind that signaled recognition rather than shock. Graymore's power trembled, not yet broken, but exposed to doubt it could not easily dismiss. Arabella felt a surge of relief followed swiftly by dread. Exposure invited retaliation. She knew that as clearly as she knew, the evidence would not disappear now that it had been seen. Sebastian stepped forward only after Arabella had finished. His movement was deliberate, his timing exact. He did not eclipse her. He positioned himself beside her, a visible alignment rather than an act of rescue. He addressed the room with calm authority, confirming what Arabella had demonstrated without restating it. His presence reframed the presentation not as a personal defense, but as a matter of public integrity. The shift mattered. It transformed her truth into shared consequence. Graymore's representative withdrew, the defeat partial but unmistakable. Too many interests were implicated for collapse to come swiftly. The season, efficient as ever, absorbed the disruption and began to adapt. Conversations resumed, altered but cautious, aware now that a line had been crossed. As Arabella left the room, the tremor returned, Not fear, but awareness of cost. She had spoken openly. She had placed truth into circulation. Whatever followed would not remain confined to whispers. She felt Sebastian's presence beside her, steady without possession, a silent acknowledgement of what had been risked and won. Later, alone, Arabella allowed herself a moment to breathe. Relief and apprehension braided together, inseparable. She had not destroyed Greymore. She had done something more dangerous. She had made them vulnerable, and vulnerability, once revealed, invited either collapse or violence. Arabella understood with absolute clarity that the season's most delicate balance had been broken. The truth was now visible. The question was no longer whether it would be contested, but how far Greymore would go to prevent it from prevailing. Retaliation came not through accusation but through erosion. Arabella felt it in the narrowing of spaces rather than their closure, in the subtle cooling of support that had only recently warmed. Greymore did not strike at her directly this time. They aimed wider, at Sebastian's standing, at the lattice of alliances that sustained influence beyond any single room. Whispers began to circulate with calculated ambiguity, questions about judgment, about entanglement, about whether proximity had compromised discretion. The language was careful, designed to invite doubt without inviting defense. Power, she understood now, preferred to wound indirectly. Sebastian absorbed the first reports with quiet focus. He did not dismiss them. He did not underestimate their reach. Instead, he assessed the pattern, recognizing the intent immediately. Financial pressure followed, subtle adjustments to long-standing arrangements that forced explanations where none had been required before. Invitations to certain councils arrived late or not at all. The message was unmistakable, aligned publicly with Arabella, and consequence would follow. Arabella felt the weight of it keenly. Guilt surfaced, sharp and immediate, an instinct to reclaim agency by removing herself from the field. She told Sebastian as much, naming the thought without disguise. If she stepped away, the pressure might ease. The calculus was familiar, offered again in a new form: safety through absence, order through sacrifice. Sebastian refused the premise outright. He told her, plainly, that he had chosen this alignment with full knowledge of its cost. He reminded her that power ceded under threat rarely stopped demanding payment. His loyalty was not reactive. It was deliberate, grounded in principle rather than impulse. The words were not dramatic. They did not attempt reassurance. They were simply true, and that truth steadied her more than any promise could have. They adjusted together. Arabella reduced her visibility without retreating, choosing her appearances with care, refusing to be baited into reaction. Sebastian countered pressure not with force but with patience, allowing Greymore's maneuvers to reveal their own desperation. The strategy was quiet, exacting, and exhausting. It required restraint from them both, the discipline to let time do what confrontation could not. Privately, the bond between them deepened under strain. Conversations grew more honest, stripped of abstraction. They spoke of cost openly now, what each was willing to risk, what lines would not be crossed. Arabella understood with clarity that Sebastian's allegiance was not a shield offered in passing. It was a stand taken with intention, and intention, once declared, carried weight that could not be rescinded without consequence. As the days passed, the initial shock of retaliation dulled into something more dangerous: normalization. The season adjusted, as it always did, absorbing disruption into new patterns. Arabella recognized the danger in that ease. Invisibility could return as acceptance if vigilance waned. She refused it. She remained present, measured, unyielding in her insistence on truth without spectacle. One evening, standing beside Sebastian in the half-light of a quiet corridor, Arabella understood the shift with sudden clarity. Loyalty had become love without declaration, devotion forged not in words but in choice repeated under pressure. The realization frightened her, not because it weakened her resolve, but because it strengthened it. Whatever Greymore attempted next would not fracture them. It would test how openly they were willing to stand when the final reckoning arrived. The demand arrived without ornament, which was how Sebastian knew it was meant to be obeyed. It came through family channels that rarely carried urgency unless consequence had already been calculated. He read the message once, then again, noting what was said and, more importantly, what was not. His presence on certain councils was questioned. His judgment was described as recently compromised. The implication followed neatly: withdraw from Arabella's cause, or accept that inheritance, influence, and standing would be recalibrated without him. It was not framed as punishment, it was framed as correction. Arabella learned of it from his silence before she heard the words. She recognized the restraint tightening around him, the way his attention turned inward as though measuring cost against principle. When he told her, he did so plainly, refusing melodrama. He named the ultimatum and its terms, offering no reassurance that the loss would be temporary or symbolic. The choice was real. The consequences would not be softened by sentiment. Her first instinct was swift and unmistakable. She prepared to leave, not in panic, not in defeat, but with deliberate clarity. She understood the shape of these demands too well to mistake them for negotiation. If she removed herself, the pressure would ease. The season would accept the narrative of correction. Sebastian's position would stabilize. The calculus was brutal but familiar, and for a moment, it tempted her with its efficiency. She began to speak of departure in practical terms, of timing, of discretion, of minimizing spectacle. Sebastian stopped her. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue point by point. He told her, with a quiet intensity that left no room for reinterpretation, that he would not accept a solution built on her erasure. He reminded her that retreat under coercion did not preserve power, it legitimized the threat. He had spent a lifetime understanding how authority was maintained, and he recognized this maneuver for what it was, an attempt to restore order by forcing him to betray principle. Arabella listened, the certainty of her resolve tested but not broken. She told him she would not be the reason his life was dismantled. He answered that she was not the reason. The lie was. The exchange was raw, stripped of politeness, hovering dangerously close to confession without crossing it. The truth lay between them, heavy and unavoidable. Whatever choice came next would define them both. They stood facing one another, the distance between restraint and surrender narrowed by necessity. Arabella felt the pull to yield, to choose sacrifice dressed as virtue. She resisted it. She had learned too much to mistake disappearance for dignity now. Instead, she named her condition plainly. She would stay, but not at the cost of becoming his weakness. If they stood, they would stand openly, equal in consequence as in intent. Sebastian accepted the terms without hesitation. The decision settled like a weight and a relief all at once. The season would not forgive this refusal easily. Family pressure would intensify. Greymore would sense the shift and exploit it if possible. Yet beneath the looming cost, Arabella felt a steadier certainty take hold. She was no longer preparing to leave, she was preparing to remain. As night fell, the city beyond the windows carried on, indifferent to the quiet recalibration taking place within its walls. Arabella understood now that the final phase was approaching. The truths they had set in motion could no longer be contained by discretion alone. When the reckoning arrived, it would demand visibility, choice, and a willingness to accept consequence without retreat. And for the first time, Arabella did not fear what that visibility might cost. Arabella did not announce her intention to leave. She simply began to prepare, the way she had learned to do everything else, quietly, efficiently, without inviting argument. The decision was not born of fear but of calculation. If she removed herself before dawn, the narrative could still be shaped as discretion rather than defeat. Sebastian's standing might yet be salvaged. The season preferred exits that did not disrupt its sense of order. She meant to give it one, even if it cost her everything she had fought to claim. The carriage was arranged for early morning, its route chosen to avoid notice. Arabella packed little. She had learned that ownership was often an illusion, and what mattered could be carried in memory and resolve alone. Her long hair was braided loosely down her back, unadorned, a small act of grounding as she moved through the familiar rooms one last time. She did not linger. Lingering invited doubt, and doubt would undo her. Rain began just as the carriage door closed, steady and insistent, the sound of it wrapping the street in anonymity. Arabella allowed herself one breath of relief as the wheels turned. Then the carriage slowed abruptly. Sebastian stood in the road ahead, rain darkening his coat, his expression stripped of every practiced reserve. He dismissed the driver with a word and climbed inside without ceremony, the confined space sharpening everything unsaid. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence, relentless and intimate. "You were leaving," he said at last, not as accusation, but recognition. Arabella did not deny it. She told him she would not allow herself to become the lever by which his life was dismantled. She spoke calmly, explaining the logic as though it were already settled. The words felt distant even as she said them. She had rehearsed them too well. Sebastian's restraint fractured then, not into anger, but into urgency. He told her he had measured the cost already. He named it without flinching: loss of favor, strain of inheritance, the narrowing of influence. He told her he accepted it. What he would not accept was her disappearance as the price of preserving appearances. The intensity of his certainty unsettled her more than any threat Greymore had made. Arabella felt the truth of it land with sudden force. This was not protection offered out of duty. This was choice, need. The realization shifted something irrevocable inside her. She saw, with startling clarity, that he was not merely standing beside her. He was unwilling to move forward without her. The moment stretched, fragile and raw, teetering on confession. Arabella felt her resolve waver, not from weakness, but from recognition. She reached for his hand, grounding herself in the reality of him, of them, when a sharp knock broke the intimacy. A messenger, breathless and soaked, delivered urgent news. Greymore had made a decisive move. Arabella released Sebastian's hand slowly, the weight of the interruption settling between them. Whatever choice she had been preparing to make was no longer sufficient. Events had overtaken discretion. She understood then that departure was no longer an option. The reckoning had arrived sooner than expected, and it would not be met from a distance. As the carriage turned back toward the city, Arabella felt fear stir, not of loss, but of exposure. The truth was ready, the world was not. And she would face both standing, no longer alone, no longer retreating, and no longer willing to trade herself for silence. The news unfolded in fragments, carried by urgency rather than clarity. Greymore had moved records, quietly, decisively, believing the timing would bury what remained before it could be assembled into anything coherent. A peripheral account, long assumed dormant, had been accessed. A clerk once thought inconsequential had been dismissed with unusual speed. The pattern was unmistakable. They were closing ranks, sealing exits, and erasing traces with the confidence of those accustomed to impunity. Arabella listened without interruption, her mind already sorting what the move revealed rather than what it concealed. Panic would serve Greymore, precision would not. The final document surfaced by accident, as such things often did, misfiled, overlooked, because it belonged to no one powerful enough to claim it. It named transactions routed through intermediaries, too minor to draw scrutiny and too numerous to be coincidence. More importantly, it bore dates that aligned perfectly with her father's last months, mapping the sequence by which pressure had been applied and blame reassigned. The implication was devastating in its simplicity. This was not negligence. It was design. Arabella read the pages twice, then a third time, her long hair slipping loose as she leaned over the table, grounding herself in the physical act of reading. Fear rose, sharp and immediate, not of exposure, but of consequence. This evidence did not merely clear her father. It implicated others whose influence extended beyond the season into governance, finance, and family. To release it would not produce a single collapse. It would fracture a network. Truth at this scale demanded courage measured not in speech, but in endurance. Sebastian watched her closely, saying nothing until she looked up. When he spoke, it was to acknowledge the cost plainly. Releasing the document would provoke retaliation beyond rumor or social pressure. It would invite legal maneuvering, political resistance, and personal risk. He did not advise caution or haste. He asked one question only: whether she was prepared to proceed knowing that control over outcome would be limited once the truth entered circulation. Arabella answered without hesitation. She said she would not negotiate truth into something palatable. She would not allow the damage to be softened for the comfort of those who had benefited from it. If justice was to be partial, it would be partial only because the world refused to finish the work, not because she had compromised it. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. She felt no bravado, only alignment. They chose their approach together, not as strategist and beneficiary, but as equals. Channels were selected for credibility rather than spectacle. Timelines were measured to prevent preemption. Each step was deliberate, acknowledging risk without being ruled by it. The decision bound them more tightly than any declaration could have. This was not a shared moment, it was a shared consequence. As night deepened, Arabella felt the weight of what lay ahead settle into her bones. She had crossed beyond defense into action, beyond survival into responsibility. The season had been her proving ground. The reckoning now demanded more than composure. It demanded truth delivered without apology. When the final preparations were complete, Arabella closed the folder and rested her hands upon it, steady and unshaking. Whatever followed would be irrevocable. Graymore had chosen to escalate. She would answer in kind, not with noise, not with fear, but with clarity that could not be folded back into silence. The forum had been chosen with care. It was neither intimate enough to be dismissed as private grievance, nor grand enough to invite theatrics. Authority gathered there out of habit rather than spectacle, which made it the only place where truth could land without being immediately reframed as scandal. Arabella entered without ceremony, her long hair arranged simply, her posture composed, aware that this room had been designed to preserve order, not justice. That distinction mattered. She spoke when invited, not before. Her voice carried evenly, neither raised nor tentative. She did not begin with accusation. She began with sequence, dates, transactions. The gradual tightening of pressure that preceded her father's ruin. Each fact was placed with care, not to overwhelm but to align. As the pattern emerged, resistance surfaced, not outrage, but discomfort. The room shifted, listeners recognizing the danger not in her tone, but in her precision. Truth, when presented without apology, was difficult to interrupt. Sebastian remained silent throughout the initial presentation. The restraint was deliberate. He understood that his voice would carry weight the moment it entered the exchange, and that weight must be used only once. Arabella finished without flourish, her final words naming consequence rather than blame. What had been done could no longer be undone. What remained was responsibility. When questions arose, they were procedural rather than dismissive. Attempts were made to reframe, to isolate the issue as anomaly rather than design. Arabella answered only what was asked, refusing speculation. The discipline unsettled those accustomed to dominance through interruption. Graymore's influence, once assumed, now appeared brittle under scrutiny. Only then did Sebastian speak. He did not defend Arabella personally. He addressed the framework itself, invoking standards long-cited but rarely enforced. He named the obligation of authority to examine itself when evidence demanded it. His tone was measured, his language precise, leaving no opening for misinterpretation. The effect was immediate. What had been positioned as a private matter was reframed as institutional failure. The shift mattered more than outrage ever could. By the time the session adjourned, nothing had been resolved, and everything had changed. Review was ordered. Records were requested. Silence, once Graymore's greatest ally, became untenable. Arabella felt the tremor of it as she gathered her papers, aware that this was not victory but passage. The truth had entered a system designed to resist it, and resistance would follow. As they left together, Sebastian did not speak of outcome. He met her gaze with something deeper than reassurance, recognition. She had not asked to be protected. She had demanded to be heard. The distinction had reshaped the room. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the fault line that had just been exposed beneath its order. Arabella breathed deeply, steady and unshaken. Whatever Graymore attempted next would not be contained by whispers. The rules had been turned inward at last, and for the first time, the season's power was being asked to answer for itself. The consequences did not arrive with spectacle. They arrived with distance. Invitations bearing Graymore's seal ceased. Conversations once conducted with effortless certainty became cautious, then avoidant. Influence did not collapse so much as loosen, threads slipping one by one until the pattern no longer held. The season adapted as it always did, quietly recalibrating around power it could no longer trust without question. Arabella felt the shift in the simplest ways, doors that opened without hesitation, glances that held respect rather than appraisal, the sudden absence of pressure where it had once been constant. Her father's name was spoken differently now. Not celebrated, but cleared. The distinction mattered. A formal acknowledgement arrived weeks later, restrained in language and careful in scope, restoring his reputation without attempting to compensate for what had been taken. Alongside it came a modest inheritance, long withheld, its value symbolic rather than transformative. It was enough to stand without apology, enough to choose without fear. Arabella accepted it quietly, grief softening into something like peace. For the first time, her past no longer defined the limits of her future. Sebastian asked nothing of her in the aftermath. He waited, not from uncertainty, but from respect. She noticed the restraint and understood its meaning. Whatever came next would be chosen freely or not at all. When Arabella finally sought him out, she did so without urgency. They stood together in unremarkable light, no audience, no pressure. The season had ended. What remained was choice. And for the first time since she had entered London with nothing, Arabella felt entirely unafraid of making it. Sebastian did not kneel, nor did he frame his words as rescue. He spoke to Arabella as an equal, his voice steady, stripped of formality and expectation. He told her he loved her not because she had endured, but because she had refused to disappear. He admitted that he had changed the rules because the world had tried to diminish her, and he would not accept it. The offer he made was simple and irrevocable: partnership, shared consequence, shared future. Arabella answered without hesitation. She chose him freely, without surrendering herself. The acceptance was quiet, absolute, and final. The season closed without announcement, as it always did, leaving behind altered habits rather than declarations. Arabella marked the ending by hosting a small gathering of her own, one designed without hierarchy or performance. Invitations were extended where they had once been withheld. Conversation flowed without calculation. Presence mattered more than pedigree. Sebastian stood beside her openly, not directing, not intervening, lending influence without eclipsing her authority. Their union did not announce a triumph. It established a precedent. Arabella moved through the room with ease, her long hair loose, her confidence unguarded. The rules had not vanished. They had been rewritten, quietly, irrevocably, by choice, by courage, and by love that refused to diminish either of them.